Welcome back. It's season 2 of the ESG is Me podcast. This is the podcast where each week we dive into environmental, social and governance topics, showing how H&MV Engineering and our wider community are tackling sustainability and ESG.
This season we're switching it up and we'll have external guests and our colleagues joining us to give an outside perspective on environmental, social and governance. My name is Sinead.
My name's Kate. Here we go. Today we're delighted to have Paddy Woodworth here with us. He has a distinguished background in journalism, including roles as arts editor and assistant foreign desk editor at TheIrish Times. Paddy has built a career centred in in-depth reporting and storytelling. He is also a leading voice in ecological restoration, which we'll talk about here today, a field he has championed through writing and research. His most recent book are Once and Future Planet, Restoring the World in a Climate Change Century, has brought critical attention to restoring ecological systems as a key strategy piece and the climate and biodiversity crisis. I suppose that's a kind of a...
Well, I wish
There's
it was,
a lot to
I wish it
unpack
was as
there.
good as it sounds. You know? But thank you.
Yeah, no, delighted to have you with us today. And I suppose you're our first external guest to the podcast.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a good one at that.
Exactly. Welcome, Paddy.
Thank you.
Paddy, you started as a journalist and you've gone from journalist to ecological restoration. Can you tell us how that journey?
Very roughly, very quickly, I've had an odd career in journalism in that I've kind of always ridden two horses at the same time. So I started as reporting on the armed conflict in the Basque Country in the 1970s. But then when I came back to Ireland, I was also interested in the arts. And long story short, I became arts editor of the Irish Times and was very involved in that for a period, but still going back to Spain to report on elections or if there was some big attack or something. In the 90s, I began to feel that I wanted to do something different. And I wrote a book about the Basque Country then and actually wrote 2 books over the next 15 years. But when the first Basque book came out, I decided that I wanted, well, first of all, it was much more successful than I'd expected, particularly places I hadn't expected it to succeed or weren't even on my radar, like American universities. So I was on a fellowship at an American university based on the Basque book, but it was very open-ended. And we were invited out on a weekend of ecological restoration. And I had no idea what this was. I was interested in nature, particularly interested in birds, but I wasn't an ecologist. I had no scientific training. And I'd grown up, and it was interesting, there was an English novelist on the same program as I was on who knew a lot more about the environment than I did. And we both said restoration. We didn't understand the word in an ecological context. And this is 20 years ago. I think it's much more familiar now. But we had grown up in a world where you basically understood that there were 2 things you could do with nature. You could develop it for our own use, which obviously we've got to do. We've got to eat, we've got to have shelter, etc., etc., etc. Perhaps we've gone too far down that road, but that's a different question. But if you do develop it, as you know, we degrade it and ultimately we destroy ecosystems. And the other thing you do is kind of based on the American National Parks model, which is you build a fence, you keep the people out. In the case of the Americans, you actually throw the people out if they happen to be Native Americans. And you say it's kind of nature inside the fence and we're outside the fence. And in a way, it's a very unhealthy way of looking at nature, you know, that parks where the only people are either scientists or tourists. So what restoration suggested was, as the name implies it, I thought of restoration, you know, you restore a car, a motorbike, a guitar, particularly paintings perhaps, a house. The idea that you could restore a damaged ecosystem went against everything I feared, I suppose. I thought once an ecosystem was degraded, that was it. And this message that you could actually bring, for example, a prairie that had been nothing but sweet corn for the last 100 years, that within 20 years you could have it behaving environmentally like a prairie when white settlers first arrived. That to me was quite magical. And it also struck me, I had an idea for a subtitle of the book that didn't fly with publishers, was that to call it a good news story, or subtitle it, a good news story from the environmental movement. Because what I think restoration teaches us is that we need to get our hands dirty, we need to work on restoring ecosystems, but we don't have to be the bad guys on the planet. We can make things better again. We can heal wounds. So I found that very appealing. The young novelist on the program, he said, I wonder if this is just a piece of American Midwestern nostalgia, or are people doing it in other parts of the world? And then he paused and he said, wouldn't it make a very interesting book to look at restoration around the world? And I thought, Jesus, it would make a great book. But then I thought, but it's Gregory's idea, you know? So I waited for a couple of weeks and I took him out for a pint and I said, are you going to write that book you mentioned? And he said, absolutely not. He said, I only write fiction. So I said, well, do you mind if I write it? And he said, no, not as long as you mention me every time. So I've done my duty by Gregory again.
That was all kicked off from that first, I suppose, initial site visit that you had out over
just
Spain.
Seeing a couple of prairies under restoration in the company of somebody who was very experienced in restoration. And then what I did find was that, no, this isn't just a bit of Midwestern nostalgia. It exists all over the world. I looked at projects in Vietnam, Australia, Costa Rica, Mexico, and every country in the world, I think, now has some form of restoration undergoing. And of course, what I also discovered, and you know, my ignorance here was complete, was that there were people, or you know, Bord Namona was already just beginning to restore some bogs. Wheelchair were restoring some woodlands, and other people were working on marine restoration projects, etc. here. So it was an Irish thing as well. So I was able to do 2 Irish chapters in the book as well. And that came out in 2003. Sorry, came out in 2013. I started it in 2003. But a lot of projects have expanded exponentially, as you know, through your work through Home Tree since then.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I suppose just touching on that, your, I suppose, initial, you know, realization into, you know, the power that individuals or companies can have in terms of biodiversity or ecological restoration, to kind of put your old self in the seat of someone who's listened to the podcast. Can you just kind of give a brief description as to what the essence of biodiversity or ecological restoration means?
Well, I think what biodiversity means is biodiversity in one sense is everything.
Everything, yeah.
Because, you know, we and the things we produce are actually part of biodiversity as well. We have created very diverse environments for ourselves. But primarily when we talk about natural biodiversity, what we're talking about is the variety of systems that exist in an ecosystem. And I think the key thing to understand is that in any given ecosystem, these species have all evolved together. They all affect each other. And I think one of you on one of the podcasts last year mentioned that it's not just about planting trees. It's about planting the right trees, and I would add, in the right places. And sometimes it's about cutting down trees, which is very counterintuitive, or getting rid of an alien invasive plant like rhododendron that is, instead of increasing the diversity, is decreasing it. The more diversity there is, you're likely, in many situations, you're going to get carbon sequestered, that is carbon captured from the atmosphere, which compensates to a degree for the amount of carbon we're releasing. Though I think we've always got to work at both ends of the scale, at restoration and at mitigation measures, which are, sorry, not mitigation, that is mitigation. I think in terms of what you're doing with Home Tree, you're investing in their restoration, in their restoring native Irish woodlands.
Right, yeah.
But you're also, as I understand it from your podcast last year and your ESG report, you're also working on, for example, finding less carbon negative forms of concrete and steel.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, that's so you're reducing your output.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just looking at the one aspect, and I suppose with the way that climate action and biodiversity and everything that kind of comes together, they're all dependent on one another in order to, I suppose, get to that end goal of net zero and then positive in terms of afterwards. Yeah.
And it is something, it is at every scale, from individual to societal. So from the individual through companies through the state can be involved in restoration. What do I mean by that? Even if you have a window box,
Yeah.
if you plant a native plant on a window box, that will support native insects, which support native birds, etc., etc. So it can be very small scale. It can, I think the community involvement is great. And one of the things that has been transformed in the last 20 years is a Tidy Towns competition, which now understands that what we used to think of as being untidy hedgerows, roadside verges, roundabouts,
Yeah.
are actually very healthy. And
It's like a psychological thing that needs to change within, because like as in for us, or for people, the layperson seeing it, oh, they think that it would have to be tidy and neat. But whereas we
Exactly.
need to kind of change that perspective on its head.
yes, and I think Tidy Towns, and when the very title Tidy Towns, it's not been easy for them to do this. And I think they deserve huge credit for the biodiversity work they're doing.
But they need to educate us.
Yeah.
They need to know. And like when you see the signs for wild gardens and all those things, people are kind of understanding it, or no mow may, or all those things. They kind of bring that education there a little bit.
I think there's been a huge shift in the last 5 to 6 years. There's still a lot of barriers to be overcome. We need to move much faster than we're doing, because climate change is moving faster than the worst predictions of science.
So if we could start today, blank check, the whole lot, what would we start on straight off? What would you?
You as your company?
Yeah, us as a company.
Well, I think a lot of the things you're doing already, as far as I can see, or at least that you're intending to do already, because I understand that ESG, is very clear from the podcast last year, is kind of a new concept for you, and that to some degree you're still working out what it means. But I think one of the key things that you have recognized is that this isn't just about you as a company, it's about your whole supply chain. You've got to look at the impact, the costs and the benefits of every action you and all of your suppliers take. And I think with the new EU directive on reporting, it will become easier. At least it will become easier perhaps to persuade some of your suppliers who mightn't be as well intentioned as you are, that they need to go this route, that they're actually mandated to go this route now.
And what about educating those suppliers on it? So yes, they'll have to do it because it's legislative, but doing it because it's the right thing to do. How do you go about doing that?
I think one of the best ways of educating people is actually site visits. Bring people to a degraded riverbank which will be eroding into the river. You'll see the river filling up with silt or with peat. You'll see that there are no fish in it because of that. Bring them to a restored riverbank where there's natural growth along the riverbank that is keeping the land where it should be on the land and releasing nutrients into the river, but not too many of them. And I just think one site visit is worth more than, many thousands of words. But I know you've developed some green sites, or you're developing one green site anyway. I know as I say, you're involved in the Home Tree project. And I think you mentioned a restoration project of a lake in India. I wasn't clear it was your company who had done that or another company. But anyway, in creating these spaces, there's loads of science now, medical science, to show that our health is improved by contact with healthy, natural, biodiverse ecosystems. So you're improving the health of your staff, and maybe you're saving on sick days, I mean, that's building out the equation a long way, but it's not entirely far-fetched, I don't think.
Yeah. I think there's 2 points, but like the first point that you mentioned there in terms of the supply chain and bringing them to the actual site so they can understand the difference between the good and the bad. And I suppose what you mentioned with Home Tree as well, Home Tree allow us to bring staff onto their site.
Great.
And actually get your hands dirty, show how the seed of a tree is built up and then grows into your small tree and then your more mature tree over time, and then take those actual small tree seeded trees onto the land that we purchased with them, and kind of having the whole cycle of understanding it comes from a seed and then it's built into this tree, but then why you need to pick certain trees, like you were saying, the right type of tree in the right type of place.
Or sometimes remove.
Exactly,
tree.
exactly. And especially with the rhododendrons as well, I know around South Tip is absolutely covered in them. They may look beautiful, but
they're very beautiful, and they're very beautiful in the right place, which is
Absolutely.
basically Rhododendron ponticum, which is what we have here, basically around Turkey. It's actually a very rare and valued plant in Spain,
yeah,
but our wet and now increasingly wet and climate
yeah,
is very suitable for it. So most notoriously, it is destroying the pristine oak woods in Kerrane National Park.
yeah. And going into nature capital and natural capital, and I suppose understanding the actual cost that one item might have on the ecosystem, and then I suppose looking at the holistic picture of adding everything up. Can you just describe to us maybe a short description
Sure.
as to what that means?
Natural capital is really just a metaphor, a way of explaining the value of nature. It's not about putting a price on nature. Some environmentalists hate it because they think it's like putting dollar signs on daisies.
Yeah.
It's not actually doing that. And I've always found the clearest example to me personally, maybe because I love woodlands, is a woodland that, and you use timber in your substations, etc., etc. So again, you think of what is the price of timber? What should the price of timber be? Well, if you look at a woodland and you're a classical economist or business person, you just see one thing. You see a resource, which is timber. And that resource is really important. And yes, we absolutely need it and will continue to need it. But if you look at it from a natural capital valuation point of view, you would look at all of the assets in that wood. It is as if you were looking at a bank vault and you were only looking in one vault and seeing timber. But there's lots of other vaults that you're not valuing that disappear when you take the timber out. So what might those values be in a woodland? Well, they could be carbon sequestration, for example. Woodlands are really important for capturing carbon from the environment. It can also be for flood mitigation. Water flows much more slowly from woodland than from open country, and therefore you may be saving a lot of money in your local town or village by keeping a lot of your local woodland. And I'm not saying no forestry, I'm not saying that at all. Forestry has to continue, but there are much more environmentally friendly ways of forestry than clear cut. What other values might there be in a woodland? Well, pollination. Pollinators are hugely important. Einstein is believed to have said that if all bees went extinct tomorrow, humanity wouldn't survive for more than another 4 years. We forget how our agriculture is dependent on these almost invisible little creatures going around pollinating plants. They're important for biodiversity as a value in itself, and I think nature does have a value in itself. And we experience this value when we go out walking, hiking, cycling, bringing the kids, playing in forests. And as I say, there's a lot of evidence now that that is very good for your physical and mental well-being. So it's basically natural capital, and there's an organisation called Natural Capital Ireland, and they provide services to companies to do natural capital accounts. So you could look at what is our timber really costing, because I think one of the basic ideas behind natural capital is that we tend to think that nature is a subset of the economy, that nature is kind of nested in the economy. It's not.
Yeah.
The economy is nested within the wider circle of nature.
Yeah.
And if nature collapses, and collapse is not too strong a word for what we've just seen in Central Europe with flooding now, the kind of wildfires we're seeing, the kind of wars we're seeing driven by climate-driven migration. All of these factors are making it imperative that we change. And farmers, above all people, they know that for their land to continue to be productive, they need to be nested within healthy systems. And again, quite small things can make changes. And
What do you think of companies adopting the ESG policies, and what do you see the challenges there for them?
well, I think the challenges are very big. As you say, it's an education. Our attitudes up till, say, the 1960s even, most people weren't thinking about the environment. In the 60s, there was a big shift. I mean, you've clean water, clean air, biodiversity legislation, all under Richard Nixon, who we think of, and he was a very conservative president, but all under him in the 1960s, there was a shift. A river went on fire in North America. It was so polluted, such a high oil content, that it actually went on fire. The very dramatic things happened like that. We also were aware of the hole in the ozone layer. And we got rid of the hole in the ozone layer. So, you know, change can happen. But I think it's from the 60s to now again, there's been a sea change. Populations are expanding hugely. Land use, I mean, your supply chain, how much rainforest is I don't know, I've no idea. But it's something to look at, is elements of your supply chain will almost inevitably be degrading land that is natural or semi-natural at the moment. And so I think we need to try and stabilize population. Perhaps we all need to live differently, all of us.
And I suppose we had the conversation beforehand as well, looking at the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And I suppose companies haven't focused on these different aspects of ESG before. But now, finally, I suppose we'll start reporting in 2026 and 2025 data. And then it will be, I suppose, a cascading effect of different companies of different sizes to start reporting on that. So at least we can have a baseline. We can understand where we are. We can understand our supply chain in terms of, you know, what are the positives, the negatives, and the improvements that need to be made there. And then make a plan into figuring out how we're going to reduce, and I suppose, our own impact, and then how we can, you know, have a positive impact in the communities that we're working with or on the supply chain to try to influence them to make better decisions and be the kind of company that says, okay, well, we're not going to work with you if you're going to be contributing to forest deforestation.
Exactly.
Or, you know, those kind of things. And be that
so I think
agent
the
of
reporting
change.
directive is important. I think you need a carrot and a stick in all of these things. And the directive is the stick, I guess. You know? But the carrot is the benefits you're bringing. And I think people will feel better about their work. I mean, one of the things I didn't mention, but in passing about restoration, is that a lot of people suffer from environmental despair at the moment. A lot of people feel a sense of, I can't watch another David Attenborough program, you know, it's just too depressing. If you get involved in restoration, it's not like, you know, I mean, you're changing the entire world, but you are changing a bit of the world, and that makes you feel better about yourself and better about the world. There is a feel-good factor.
But even on that, is there anything that you could, I suppose, give as pieces of advice for staff members or for people who listen to the podcast on individually, what can they do in their own lives? Because I suppose something that we really believe in is the collective power of individual action really can make a difference.
I'd say see if there is a restoration scheme locally, like Home to One, that you can volunteer for. I think, and there is that, or as I say, think about your own garden, or if you've no garden, your yard, and if you've only got a windowsill, you know, there are all sorts of ways in which you can intervene. So, you know, plant the right things in the right places. Don't plant the wrong things.
Yeah. And there's another initiative that we're working with the local sawmill. We're taking some of the waste timber from our sites, and he's basically building a wild native black bee box.
Oh, fantastic.
So not your standard
so
honeybee.
your sort of circular economy and recycling.
The whole circular loop thing that we're trying to do at the moment as well. And he's putting those particular top barrel is the style of it. And he has it put in a native woodland just on the river shore here. And what he's doing is he's really into it now. He's looking into the symbiosis between the bees and natural wood louse and other different materials.
That's news to me.
So he's putting the loads of moss and like debris from the woodland floor into the beehive, and it actually encourages more bees because there's a symbiosis between the two, and it encourages more native Irish black bees rather than the honey producing side of things. But it's just different because you normally think like, oh, if you've got loads of bees and honey, like that's biodiversity. But in essence, the natural capital thing, it's not.
Not necessarily.
Not
necessarily. You need the whole system.
Yeah, absolutely. Will we do some quick fire?
Yeah, quick fire questions. Okay. Your favourite national park?
In the world or in
the
Ireland? In the world, I think the conservation area of Guanacaste in Costa Rica, where the most extraordinary, huge scale restoration is done.
Best environmental book you've read recently?
I think I'd have to say Greenery, Journeys in Springtime by Simon D.
Least favourite invasive species?
I think for me it has to be rhododendron because I've seen its effects, particularly in Kerrane. So, I mean, you could also add Sika deer to that because, you know, whatever oak seedlings can come up around the rhododendron, the Sika deer will eat. So there's two problems there.
Yeah. Fair enough. One thing everyone could do to be more sustainable?
I think start thinking about your carbon footprint, the kind of car you drive, how often you fly. Use public transport more.
Favourite insect?
Favourite insect? I think I'd have to say butterfly.
Favourite bird?
Favourite bird? Crane.
Favourite animal?
Favourite animal in this country or in the world?
Either.
In this country at the moment, I think pine marten.
Oh, yeah.
Which is cat crown, the tree cat in Irish.
Well, I think you've answered this, but your favourite animal?
Well, pine marten here. In the world, elephant maybe.
And the final one. One thing everyone can do to improve the biodiversity in their area?
Well, again, I'd say plant a native plant in the right place. Or get rid of an invasive plant if it's causing damage. But do it carefully. Make sure you know what you're doing, that you're not, for example, by taking out an invasive plant, you could be causing some erosion. So be careful about it.
Is there anything last positive note or I suppose something that you've seen over the years that would put I suppose, all this work that people are trying to do, and there's an awful lot of doom and gloom when it comes around to the climate crisis, and as you said, a lot of people have, I suppose, anxiety and different negative thoughts about
Sure. Well, I would just reiterate that in restoring nature at any level, you're actually restoring yourself and your own well-being and your real place in the world.
Absolutely. So, Paddy, where can people find out more about the work that you're doing? I know you have the book and you have loads of other items. Can you tell
Yeah,
me?
well, the best place to go, I suppose, would be my website, which is www.paddywoodworth.com. So it's pretty straightforward. And there you can see the books, you can read extracts from the books, you can read reviews. I also try and keep it updated with my most recent articles, say from the Irish Times, where I write for the science page from time to time. And my broadcasts from the Naturalist Bookshelf on Culture File, on Lorcan Murray's Classic Drive on Lyric. So I think any information, including my email address, if anyone wants to write to me, I'm always happy to answer questions. Prefer to answer questions by email than social media. I have become increasingly uncomfortable with social media. But the website is the best place to go.
And then what time on Lyric FM on Mondays is that on it?
Well, it's if it's on, not on every week, often on a Monday if it is, and it's the Culture File slot, which does a lot of other things as well, is usually on about 20 to 7.
Brilliant. Lovely. Thank you so much.
In the evening.